Good afternoon. My name is Kerwin Charles. I'm the Deputy Dean at the Harris School. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you to the second installment of our Contemporary China lecture series. At the Harris School, we're interested in the design and optimal implementation of policy around the world. It is true that much of our focus historically has been on the domestic sphere, but increasingly we're thinking harder about international questions. And China is at the very top of our list of areas to investigate more deeply. Now, it was therefore with great delight that we received an email from the Paulson Institute suggesting that we host a series. This series is their idea, and the driving force for this series is Evan Feigenbaum, who will be introducing today's speaker. Evan comes to the university, comes to the Paulson Institute, having had a host of positions in the academy, in the public sphere, in the private sector. So Evan has had a vastly richer life than most of the people with whom he interacts at Harris, and we're thrilled to have him in our midst. This is, as I said, the second installment of what we hope will be a year-long series. Many of you were here in January for our first one. I'm sorry, in October, I'm sorry. We will not have one in December, and so the series will resume in January on the 27th. I hope you come. Thanks very much for coming today, and I'll turn it over to Evan to introduce today's speaker.
Thanks. Okay, of course, this series was not actually our idea, it was Colm's idea. So the Dean of the Harris School, Dean Colm. So we're delighted to be doing this with the Harris School. I see a lot of familiar faces, so I won't dwell on the Institute, except just to say again that we have a growing range of opportunities for students. If you're a pre-doctoral student and you're working towards your dissertation and you do contemporary China, especially in the social sciences, we have some fieldwork support opportunities. So take a look at our website. We have student fellows, some of whom I see in the audience. We've had intern opportunities in Beijing. So come visit us, knock on the door. We're just down the street. And we have lots going on for students on China. I'm really delighted that we could have Orville Shell here. Not just because we're old friends, but because when I don't know if you want to be called an old China hand, but when I first got interested in China, it was the early to mid 1980s. And one of the first sets of books that I read was this China Reader that you had put together with Franz Schermann, who was then a professor at Berkeley, I think, and it was on Imperial China and Republican China and Communist China and Contemporary China. So Orville was among the first names that I knew in the China field. And I think I dare say that you're one of the first names that a lot of people knew in the China field, not just because you've been observing China for a long time, but also because Orville's somebody who's lived a lot of different lives with China, but not just China. You've done a lot of other things besides China as well. So Orville's been a journalist. Orville's been a filmmaker. One of the best frontline documentaries I've ever seen was one that you did. He's been a dean of the journalism school at the University of California, Berkeley. He now runs a China Center at the Asia Society, so you're a think tanker and convener. But more importantly, he's one of the deepest thinkers on China, I think, in the United States over the last few decades. And he has a new book out that brings a lot of those themes together. So we've left this open-ended to give Orville the chance to talk a little bit about how you see China, where you see it going, where you think it's come from. I know your book has some historical perspective. So I want to welcome Orville. We're delighted you're here. And I'm really thrilled that you have the opportunity to hear from him. So with that, Orville, let me turn it over to you, and we'll let you talk a little bit and then open it up to the audience. Great. Thanks. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Evan. Would it be too presumptuous if I stood up here? You might be able to see me a little better. Thank you, Evan. It's great to be here. It is true that I've spent many years trying to see to the heart of the China matter. And I think it's also fair to say that this is looking in from the outside, as those of us who are Americans must. It's often a very perplexing question. And I recently as Evan mentioned, published a book, with the title of which is there. And what it was a survey through modern Chinese history to try and understand how this country, which after so much failure, so many defeats, finally did manage to galvanize itself, economically speaking, to enjoy the period of economic growth that has really characterized it ever since the early 80s. And in doing this, going back and reading hundreds and hundreds of books, many of which I'd read in the past, I began to realize that I had absolutely no sort of way to explain the flow of Chinese history, why things happened the way they did. For me, it's very important to understand how Chinese history culminated in the present. Because the present is, after all, part of this nation, China, that is of profound consequence to not only Americans, but everybody in the world, it now turns out. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a tour of this sort of interesting process that I underwent to try to understand what was going on over the last 100 years, 150 years in China, and how it adds up to today, and where that leaves us in sort of a policy perspective in regard to the U.S. and China. I know many of you are from the policy school. If you look back and ask yourself that question of what was it that was flowing through Chinese history, pushing it forward, I think you have two very, very different ways of looking at it. When I studied China, I was a historian, we had a very Western perspective, I now come to see. And that was this notion that history is moving sort of inescapably in a certain direction. This is very much Hegel, Marx adopted it, this notion of sort of a dialectic process moving throughout time, pushing history forward. And I think the Western presumption has always been that history is moving towards greater openness, greater democracy, very much in the Enlightenment spirit of which most Westerners are schooled and grow up. And there was a kind of a sense, I think, that was manifest very clearly when someone like President Bill Clinton said to China, "You are on the wrong side of history." You know, of history having a direction, and we in the West sort of knew what it was, but China was on the wrong side of it, and that wasn't a good place to be. And as I read through all of the literature to write this book, it became quite evident to me that in a certain sense, the way I had been educated, and the way I think many of you are often educated, to believe that history does have a kind of an ineluctable, inescapable direction, and that it is going inevitably towards greater openness and democracy. Who knows? Now, that may be true in the long, long run, but it may not be true in the short run, or in fact, it may not be true at all. Maybe history has no direction whatsoever, and maybe different models are just as relevant and just as viable. This is important in the question of China because one is now left to ask, does China in fact have a model of development that's rather unique? Some might call it authoritarian capitalism, Leninist capitalism, call it what you will. There's even a greater temptation, I think, to ask that question, which we never would have asked 10 years ago. You remember Francis Fukuyama and the end of history? Well, we had arrived at the final Hegelian destination. Democracy had triumphed all over the world. China was on the wrong side of it, and China was probably not going to amount to a great deal until it got onto the right side of history. Well, then something very strange happened. History started up again. There was no end to history. Not only did it start up again, but it turned out that it was China in a certain curious way that started it up again. And it did that by having repeated years of roughly 10% growth, this trajectory of sustained economic growth, yes, with many, many problems, many, many contradictions, but the likes of which no Western society had really seen, at least recently. We've always had a much more cyclical pattern of recessions, depressions, and here was China just sort of sailing onward and upward in a seemingly irresistible and successful way. This, despite the fact that when I was your age and studying and teaching, we had all sorts of development theories about how underdeveloped countries could develop, involved nation building and Western aid and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, all sorts of different regimens and all sorts of different high priests of development theory. And then when history ended, a la Francis Fukuyama, and China started it up again, this was a development model nobody had really plotted. Nobody had really defined as being even existing, much less as being successful. Now, I don't want to suggest that I think this is a perfect model, that I particularly like the model, or I would want to live under such a model, but I do want to say that it threw into a sense of relief as I was writing this book, the ways in which I and my co-author, John Deluria, a brilliant young scholar, were really looking at things, had looked at things with a very Western frame of mind. So we asked ourselves, and what was the sort of the Chinese frame of mind? I don't want to go on too long about it, but if you go back and you look at the people that we looked at in this book, and we started off with, those of you who are Chinese will know, Wei Yuan at the sort of during the and before the Opium War, first Opium War, Feng Guifen, who was one of the early self-strengtheners, you know, the Zijiang Yundong. Then we moved on to Cixi, the Empress Dowager, who actually, if you read her now in this new book that's just come out on her by Zhang Rong, you realize many of the issues she confronted at the end of the Qing dynasty are exactly the issues that the leadership in China is confronting today. You know, how much to reform? How fast to reform? You go too slow, you die. You go too fast, you die. What do? You know, how do you manage, ride that tiger? Then we did Liang Qichao, we did Sun Zhongshan, Sun Yat-sen, Chen Duxiu, Chiang Kai-shek, Mao, Deng Xiaoping, and Zhu Rongji, and then finally Liu Xiaobo. And the reason why we wanted to end on Liu Xiaobo was precisely because in many ways he represents the thinking that is most sort of prominent in the West of, you know, democracy as an ideal, democracy as an end, democracy as sort of the goal towards which history should be going, perhaps must be going. But as we read through all of these other people, something else very striking jumped out. That there were people who were interested in democracy and openness and constitutionalism. But the main current, and something that almost everybody shared, was something else quite different. It was nationalism and this idea of fuqiang, of wealth and power, namely of restoring China to a position of greatness. And now you have Xi Jinping, the new president and party general secretary. He's got his Zhongguomeng, his Chinese dream, and his you know, the Fuxing Zhilu, the road to rejuvenation. This is really the latest extension of this dream, not of openness, not of constitutionalism, not of anything really, except what does China need to do? What does it need to borrow? And it tried Christianity, it tried anarchism, it tried fascism, it tried communism, it tried democracy, all in a very utilitarian manner. Not so much as ends in themselves, which Westerners believe these are sort of idealizations, they're ideal goals, which we are supposed to believe in and do believe in, whether they help us or not. But the Chinese sort of posture towards all of these different kinds of statecraft and political systems was more, will it work? Will it work for us? Can we gain a little fuqiang? And can we, by becoming wealthy and powerful, can we regain a place in the world? And most important, I think, is a kind of a respect. And so if you look at Chinese history from this perspective, you see an enormous consistency. Yes, there were Democrats like Chen Duxiu. You know, he was in favor in the May 4th movement of science and democracy, but he was also a nationalist. Mao Zedong was he believed in class struggle and, on and on and on. You all know about Mao Zedong, but he too was a nationalist. Deng Xiaoping was very much a guy, a very practical man who, what he really wanted to do was, he I think, understood that strength came from wealth. You have to create wealth. And thus you got his reforms in the 1980s and, these slogans like 富裕光荣, to get rich is glorious, or let some people get rich first. And you had things like the 1万元户, the 10,000 yuan households, which at the time, in the early 80s, was like the devil speaking. Because we just come out of the Cultural Revolution where nobody was supposed to have 10,000 yuan. And no incentives were supposed to be prized and supported. And so from this perspective, if you look at where China is today, and if you look for a moment at the recent third plenum of the 18th Party Congress, I know that sounds like a very dreary title, but China has party congresses because China is ruled by the Communist Party, not so much by the government, by the party structure. And these guys get together and they set sort of policy guidelines. And the third time they get together after each party congress is one of the main sort of moments of policy enunciation and definition. And what did they do? They set up the key achievements, so far as we can see. We're not sure what kinds of reforms will follow. But two very obvious concrete things they did was to set up this National Security Council, which isn't exactly like the one that sits in the White House. It has more to do with security, domestic security. And it's in the hands of Xi Jinping. In other words, he's trying to centralize power. The other thing was to set up a small working group to guide reform. But there was no mention of political reform, really, except to say that China should be under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, one party. There's not even much interest anymore in political reform. In fact, anybody who is in favor of political reform, if they speak too loudly, ends up having a rather bitter end. So in this respect, history continues to march forward in the wealth and power category, which is to unify China, to enrich China, to make China militarily strong, to make China be able to control society, to overpower any contradictions, any fracture lines that might lead to instability. This is the thrust, the ongoing thrust of the Chinese government, not so dissimilar from Sun Yat-sen, way back 100 years ago, who, if you remember what he said, was he said, first we're going to have military dictatorship. Then we'll go along and get the country unified Maybe we'll get it a little richer. Then we're going to have what he calls Xunjiang. First Junjiang, military rule. Then Xunjiang, guided democracy, sort of tutelage. And then finally, you get to constitutional government, Xinjiang. So there were 3 phases. That's the timetable. We're still in it. He thought it would take 10 years. It's taken 100, and we're still not at constitutional government yet. In fact, I would have to say Xi Jinping and the new leaders take a very dim view about anyone who talks about the Constitution. It used to be 2 or 3 years ago, you talked about the Constitution, everybody could kind of agree, we're headed in that direction, good idea, rule of law. But now there seems to be a lot of wariness about raising that issue. Why? Because it challenges the party's supremacy to unify, to control, and to keep this whole incredible, dynamic, but highly unstable proposition moving forward in an economic sense with high growth rates. So it's an interesting moment, and when Xi Jinping, when he came into power, one of the first things he did, he had a big meeting in the Great Hall of the People in Tiananmen Square, and then he took I think it was the Standing Committee, can't remember, it might have been the whole Politburo, across the square to the museum, the National Museum, where there was a display of Chinese history. And there it was there that he announced his kind of dedication to this idea of the rejuvenation of China. And this was, it just rang so true in terms of all of these people that we'd just been studying in our book. Each one of them, that was their sort of primary goal. And it continues to be it today. So if that is the case, let me just sort of end my remarks and then be very happy to take questions or hear your comments. What does that mean for U.S. China relations? As I suggested at the beginning, there is no other bilateral relationship quite like the U.S. and China. It's a relationship that's incredibly contradictory, in that there's a tremendous amount of I think, admiration on each side, of even love, of fascination, seduction, closeness. The two countries have had an enormously long and complicated history. On the other hand, there's an awful lot of animosity, tremendous amount of suspicion, paranoia about the intentions of each other, and distrust. And the challenge is, how do you get to the root of that distrust when we've had, you know, when I first went to China in 1975, and every wall and every smokestack and every factory, you know, it said, you know, down with the American imperialists and their running dogs. And that was really deep, this idea that China had been preyed upon by the West. And America was the most powerful and the most predatory power in the world in the 1970s. And that, interestingly, out of that experience, which of course Lenin really codified into a whole principle of Leninism, namely that the imperialist world, the capitalist countries of the West and Japan were exploiting the underdeveloped world to their benefit. So China was the victim. China was being exploited. It created this 100 years of humiliation, which the Communist Party still talks about. Never mind that they've had astounding successes, you know, in terms of economic development, infrastructure building, you name it. There are a lot of successes. The national narrative is one of defeat, victimization, and humiliation. Nowhere is this more obvious than in relation to Japan. And I won't say that there's no cause for it. I mean, I can understand it. Japan was savage and brutal to China. However, that was then, and this is now. And nobody is imperializing China now. And yet this narrative of victimization continues. And you go to that show in the National Museum, Fuxing Zhilu, the Road to Rejuvenation, every single panel you see it. So whereas the West has these narratives of victory, triumph, success, China oddly has this narrative of defeat and victimization. Very interesting question. I won't get into it now. Suffice it to say that it actually, because of, I think, certain Confucian sort of traditions and whatnot, has turned in an interesting way in China to serve as a motivation, sort of as a stimulant rather than as a depressant, to goad Chinese forward into making something of their country, to helping get Fuchang and make the country strong, powerful, unified, and respected. But this narrative of humiliation and victimization makes it very difficult to get along with a country like the United States. Because for 100 years, if that's the way you see the outside world, that's the narrative the Communist Party still insists on. And I have to tell you that I wrote an article with my co-author in the Wall Street Journal about this when our book came out 2 months ago or whenever it was. And I just got a copy of Xi Jinping's speech that he gave to the propaganda department after this article came out. And in it, the People's Daily actually had an article citing the Wall Street Journal article saying these certain foreigners had a viewpoint that it was time for China to give up its narrative of victimization, but any country that forgets its history will forget its basic essence. And I could read it to you, but and I knew exactly who they were talking about, us. And then I got the speech that Xi had given, which is the basis of the People's Daily article. And he said, no, we're not going to give it up. We weren't asking China to give up its history, forget its history, which China is actually very good at doing in other cases, to wit, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, the anti-rightist movement, you name it. These things are easily forgotten. The Western countries' domination and exploitation and occupation of China are not forgotten. And we don't want that to be forgotten, not suggesting it be forgotten, simply that every narrative needs to keep writing new chapters that keep up with real events. And real events in China now give China not only the right, but it seems to me the responsibility to start saying, well, we have, in a sense, achieved in a spectacular and amazing and unexpected way from the sick man of Asia. Remember that? Yazhou, the Bingfu. That was Liang Qiqiao. They've accomplished something that nobody for a century thought China could accomplish, which was to be an economic player, an economic power, to be strong. And so indeed, I do think it is time for the narrative to be not forgotten, the past, but to have a new chapter written. Until that happens, I think it's going to be very difficult for the US and China to get along. Because everything that the United States does, and we certainly don't do everything right, is viewed with enormous suspicion. And in terms of sort of old Cold War ways of reacting as forms of containment. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they aren't. The truth is, I think at this point, the United States very much would like to find a way to bury the hatchet with China, to set the past aside and start anew. And nobody quite knows how to do that. Now, final thought. If you look back to 1972, when Nixon and Kissinger went to China, there is enormous nostalgia about that time. Every Chinese loves Kissinger. Why? Why should they love Kissinger? Well, I think it is because that was the moment that the paradigm, that the model for relating to America got broken in a very dramatic way, and things changed. And it is a moment we keep hoping we'll find a way to reproduce in some new and modern way, and we were failing to do it. The other great moment was another moment that I happened to observe and participate in, was when Deng Xiaoping came to this country in 1979. And I went on this trip. Jimmy Carter invited him to Washington, then we went to Atlanta, we went to Houston. And one night, we visited the Johnson Space Center. We went to a little town called Simonton, Texas. And there was a rodeo there, a rodeo arena. And I remember this vividly. Deng Xiaoping arrived. It was a rainy night. Limo door opened. This little guy, 5 feet 3 inches, who Mao Zedong had described as a ball of cotton with a pin inside. He stepped out of the limousine, and there were these giant Texans with huge stomachs and belt buckles and these plates loaded with pork ribs and beans standing around, having this barbecue before the rodeo. And Deng Xiaoping walked in there like he was a Texas politician, shaking hands. And these guys were the most anti-communist people in the universe. This was Texas. He just melted them. He went and he sat down in his seat, which was right in the front row, as I recall, of this arena. And the next thing that happened was a couple of really gorgeous young Texas beauties rode up on stallions, galloped across the arena, and they presented him with a 10-gallon cowboy hat. And this was the first time Chinese had ever seen a live broadcast from the United States, this trip. And Deng Xiaoping, damned if he didn't just take that hat, slap it on his head, and started waving, and the crowd just went nuts. Well, this was breakthrough. Then he appeared, suddenly he disappeared from his seat, and I wondered where he went. Next 10 minutes later, he appeared in a stagecoach, like the Wells Fargo stagecoach, and like a beauty queen. He was sitting there waving out the window with his 10-gallon hat on his head. Well, listen, if you want to send symbols out that it's okay to like America to China, and it's okay for Americans to like China to Americans, this is what you do. This is theater. This is the way you get a point across. And nobody's done it since. What do we have now? We have these incredibly wooden meetings in the Great Hall of the People, or something in the White House, maybe a dinner. And we have this, we're sort of struggling to find some way to jolt this relationship up onto a new level. Because that has to happen. The United States and China are the only two countries that really matter in the world, particularly on things like climate change, nuclear proliferation, world trade. We don't get together, it's not going to work out very well. How do we do that? Nobody knows. All we have are these old instances where leaders of sterner stuff, of greater, boldness, did manage to create such moments. But 1979, how many years ago was that? So I don't quite know how the U.S. and China are going to find a way to sort of push the relationship up onto a new level where we put aside some of this historical paranoia, suspiciousness that's leading an arms race, that's leading these two powers, which have to cooperate but have a difficult time doing it, into this very, very cautious, suspicious mode of interaction. Yes, we have different political systems. Yes, Americans believe that communism is evil. Yes, most Americans would like to see communist regimes overthrown everywhere in the world. This is one source of the suspiciousness on the Chinese side. Maybe some of you would like to see that happen. So there are understandable reasons why we have this level of mistrust. It isn't just silly people seeing things wrong. Sometimes perceptions are correct, and it creates contradictions that are very hard to deal with. And that's where we are in the relationship. So let me end here, and then be glad to take some questions and thoughts. But suffice it to say that I think the historical experience of China itself of the U.S. and the West and China weigh very, very heavily on the present in ways that people haven't really examined and in ways in which are not obvious because the roots are buried very deep. But it does get passed on generation to generation. And this suspiciousness of the outside is not something just new to the Communist Party. It was true of the Qing dynasty. It's been true for a long time because China never did have to make itself soluble to the world. There was no sense of having to relate on an equal way with other nations in the old scheme of things. China was China. The other countries were tribute-bearing countries that came, offered gifts, kowtow to the emperor, and leave. So these historical ways of thinking, of feeling, of interacting, some of them deeply, I think, psychological rather than intellectual or political, I think still in some significant way lay at the heart of the difficulty that the two countries have today in finding a more stable way to relate, something that the world deeply needs at this particular point in its history. All right, I think I'll stop here. Yes.
Hi, Mr. Zhao, and my name is Edward Wang. I'm a second-year finance PhD at Booth School, and as well as a pre-doctoral fellow at the Paulson Institute. I actually took a delegation of students to Asia Society's headquarters in New York earlier this month, and I have to say that the museum is absolutely gorgeous, and we very much enjoyed the visit.
Good.
And we spoke with Tom Nagoski and Jonathan Landreth, and we wish we could have the opportunity to speak with you.
I think I was away. I'm sorry.
Yes, but so you actually talk a lot about the past historic development in China, and I want to ask something about the future. So the scale of U.S. China educational exchange is unprecedented right now. We have almost over 200,000 Chinese students studying in the U.S. every year now, and in the return, we try to send 100,000 U.S. kids to China through President Obama's 100,000 strong initiative, and it's also exemplified by the recent Schwartzman Scholarship. So what do you think the role of U.S.-China educational exchange can shape U.S.-China relations going forward? In particular, do you think this is a source of optimism that we should rely on, since these students will, help accelerate the cultural understandings and help break the gridlock that you mentioned just now? Thank you.
Yes, I think it's very hopeful, and I wish the United States could find a way to send more students to China. Sadly, the wealthiest nation in the world is broke. This is an embarrassing reality. Our government doesn't have the money and doesn't want to appropriate the money to run such projects. So this handicaps us. And in this regard, I think China is actually leading the way and quite far out ahead. I don't always agree with what they do, but I think the effort that they are making to push out into the world is something that America should pay attention to and should actually try to imitate. I think, that reminds me that I was recently, just this week actually, down at the Carter Center, and Carter retold this story about when he was with Deng Xiaoping, and he asked Deng Xiaoping when he was going to start liberalizing immigration policy so Chinese could leave China. This was during the period when Russians couldn't leave Russia, and there was a big issue in Congress about the freedom of people to travel. And Deng Xiaoping said, fine. He said, I think something to the effect, would you like 1 million? And Carter laughed and said, well, he said, maybe, how would you like 20,000 lawyers? We would send 20,000 lawyers to China. And Deng Xiaoping evidently said, well, I think I'll keep my 1 million and you keep your lawyers. But in a funny way, this has come to pass, that there have been literally, I think, well over 1 million Chinese students studying in this country. I often wonder what the final effect is on you all. One of the things that I'm particularly interested in, it would make a really interesting study for one of you to undertake, was how does it influence your sense of nationalism about your own country? Do you become less nationalistic? Do you become more nationalistic? Do you become more convinced that the Chinese current system of government is right, functional, proper, and constructive, or less so? This would be a very interesting kind of study to do. All right, who else? There's another microphone right here.
Professor Shell, thank you very much for your fantastic talk. So I have a question that is probably more within your journalistic expertise, because within the past for probably 1 or 2 years, we are seeing the rising tension between China and the foreign media. And we're seeing, for example, last year, Bloomberg and New York Times did several articles about the leadership, and there's a lot of articles about environment, Tibet, and stuff. So I'm wondering if you think this is like an illustration of the fundamentally different thinking of how China should be, like the Western narrative and the Chinese narrative. And do you think this is a problem that will persist, and where do you think this will lead us? Thank you.
Very, very good questions. I'm really concerned about the way in which, as China grows stronger, it sometimes chooses to exercise its power. And nowhere is this more obvious than in regard to the media, and even in terms of scholarship. One of the things China, it used to be that those of us who were in the media or the scholarly world, that we might suffer some control when we were in China. But when we were outside of China, we were free and clear. As China's become more powerful and projected more of its power out abroad, it's now decided that it wants to control people outside of China too, insofar as they speak, write, or teach about China. And one of the ways they do this is by controlling access to China, not giving visas. And if you are a scholar, a businessman, a journalist, I suppose you could even say some sort of a religious figure, whatever you are, and your business is to interact with China somehow, and you're denied access, that's incredibly difficult. And more, this is the case. And I think it's very counterproductive for China to do it. I hope the United States doesn't reciprocate. Many people spoke with someone yesterday at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York who thought we should just deny visas to Chinese journalists. Tit for tat. And I think that's really dangerous to do that. First of all, it's not what America should do. We don't always do what we should do, but this is not what we should do. But there must be some discussion of this. And as far as I can see, we talk all the time about trade access to China. Business people can get the government really stirred up if they're denied equal trade access. But when it comes to equal access in the media, in scholarship, in films, things like this, nobody says much. And I think it's wrong. Finally, I would say this as well. China wants soft power. Soft power is something you can't buy, you can't make, you can't create through propaganda or public relations, at least not very easily. It's something that a country sort of possesses because of its culture, its political system, its civil society, whatever, its films. And I think China would like to acquire soft power because it recognizes, having attained wealth and power, what it really wanted was respect. And soft power is a sign of respect. And yet, when it does things like this, denying visas to perfectly reputable journalists and scholars, it destroys its soft power. And it makes it impossible for people who might otherwise admire China to respect it. So there's a huge cost to acting this way. And I do hope that as China becomes more wealthy, more powerful, more influential, bigger military, on and on and on, that it will do what very few nations as they rise in strength or ever succeed in doing, which is to be temperate, moderate, and to try to see its best interest, not in terms of paying people back, but in terms of being a little bit more just. And this is a real weakness of China. It's a real weakness at home. It's a real weakness abroad. Yes?
Thank you very much, Professor Shell, for your presentation. My name is Eugene Han. I'm from the Harris School of Public Policy, and I'm also a PhD candidate at Tsinghua University. There are several comments that I would like to make. First thing is about the historical narrative. And when you were talking about that, it really reminded me of this historical narrative in stone. This is a part of Beijing, whereas Tsinghua University, Peking University, Yuan Mingyuan, and Zhongguancun, that is...
The Yuan Mingyuan is like ground zero
yeah.
for this narrative of humiliation.
So, as Chinese society is, I would say elitist. I would not be very afraid to use this word. Elitist, profoundly, it would... Elitist.
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 Good. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So probably this would make sense to look at this specific region. You are talking about cooperation, and again, this very specific part of Beijing is very good for seeing that. You can build as many Harvard or Stanford or UChicago centers in there as you want, and at some point, I guess it's just a diminishing return to scale. It's not in any way diminishing the historical narrative. It's still there, it's gonna be there. You could build or as many scholarship or whatever, it's still not going to make this same return to this effort. This is first thing. Second thing is about the democracy and economic development, which is very well stated thing, but somehow very poorly understood. It was that idea that all of the rich countries are democratic and therefore you become democratic, then you become rich. And many developing countries now, they see China as a model. So my intuition in a sense would be that China might not be willing that much to make this relationship with the United States closer because it's against its interest. It would like more to rely on this soft power, if you wish, with the developing world, rather than bargaining with the United States where it has like unfavorable position at this point. So I would probably say that it would be a reason or might be a reason for the multilateralism in the future, and that probably in my intuition, this relationship will not probably get where you think.
Well, interesting comments. Two things occur to me. One is they haven't done such a great job with the other countries outside their borders. The truth is, when you really look at it, who are China's friends? And you look at what's happened in the South China Sea in the last few years. You know, whether it's with Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, even Malaysia to some degree. You know, the relations aren't very good. So it's not like that they've, by de-emphasizing the bilateral relationship with the U.S., they've been able to shore up relationships around them. There's a lot of suspiciousness about China, too, all the more so because of these island disputes. It may be, you know, that in a way that China decides it doesn't quite suit its core interest, it has that term, to get too close to the United States. I hope it doesn't conclude that, because if we don't find a way to get closer together, there are these problems that I suggested, which will go unresolved. And climate change is no joke. And China is now the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. The consequences of climate change, you get up on the Tibetan Plateau and you look at the glaciers. I mean, I won't go into this as something I have an interest in. You look at the hydrology of China, the North China Plain, the Nanshui Beidia, the South-North Water Transfer Project to bring water from the south to the north. I mean, China is in deep, deep trouble. And climate change is influencing changes in disturbing weather patterns that are going to have a profound consequence for that country because it's so delicately balanced. And cities like Shanghai are going to be submerged. So this isn't an option. So I do hope that all of you who are Chinese and American will do what you can to urge our respective governments to take these things seriously. It isn't like we can just play with our paranoia because we have a narrative of paranoia. And, you know, we have to do what Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, who in many other ways I didn't particularly admire or respect, but they did this rather extraordinary thing. They jumped over their shadow. And I think we need to do that again. And I think the Chinese leadership needs badly to break out of its rut of communist jargon and rigid protocol. And I think Xi Jinping tried to do a little of that at the Sunnylands conference with Barack Obama, you know, where they took off their neckties and they, you know. But there was a tiny little hint of it. So, thoughts? In the back, and then I'll take you. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, I wanted to again welcome you for coming and speaking to us today. I believe it was last week there was a bombing against a government official in the Shaanxi province, and the thing that was really surprising or really newsworthy about it was the amount of antipathy or not support, but sort of ambivalence towards it through so much of the population who were frustrated through corruption with government officials. And earlier in your talk, you were speaking of trying to navigate the pace of economic and political liberalization. How do you balance these with, there's obviously a need that's now starting to be formed in violence with maintaining the proper course going forward?
Yeah. Well, I must say, I have, you know, and here I have enormous sympathy for the challenges that the Chinese leadership confronts. They're enormous. You know, the social discontent, social unrest, the gap between rich and poor, environmental problems, one can go on and on and on. These are daunting, daunting problems. And how does one reform boldly enough under the threat of all these problems without upsetting everything and running the whole train off the tracks? And it's not an easy thing to see. It's not as if there's some very obvious pathway that the leadership refuses to see. We in the West may think they should be less oppressive, less, censoring, less controlling of debate and dialogue. They see it very differently. They see it as, this was one of the bad effects of 1989, is that the Chinese Communist Party took one look at what happened there and they said, never again. We're never going to let anybody say anything because we don't want to let that snowball get rolling. So the effect was to make the environment much more constricted. And this is the dilemma they face. And I said it earlier, you can reform too much, you die. You reform too little, you die. And that's the challenge that this government is facing, and it's why when they issue a statement on reform, it comes out reading like something that Google translated. You can just see everybody's had their oar in there and every interest has been satisfied, and it's just very hard to see how you get out of that boldness. But I do believe that Xi Jinping, he's very much a Leninist. He very much believes that the Chinese Communist Party is the salvation of China, should not be overthrown or challenged. On the other hand, I also believe he's a smart man. And I think that he recognizes that sometimes it doesn't do well to speak too loudly and too boldly, to stick your tail up. There's an expression in Chinese, the "chao wei ba," you stick your tail up in the air. Because in the present scheme of things, a big leader is not welcomed. It's much more of a consensual situation in the leadership where people don't boldly write themselves large in public with all of their proclamations about what they're going to do and what they think. The last guy who did that was who? Bo Xilai. And look where he went. So you have to recognize that whatever his views are, we don't know what they are. He hasn't publicly explained them. And why is that? Because it doesn't serve his purposes to do so. Does that mean he has no ideas? He has no principles, no plan? I seriously doubt it. What it probably means is that he's going to have to feel his way forward and see what he can get away with and do it quietly. This is also true of Deng Xiaoping. I mean, he did this monumental counter-revolution against Mao's Cultural Revolution. He did say some pretty bold things at his third plenum in 1978, but what was really bold was what he did afterwards. And he just kind of did it. These things, I remember being in Beijing, walking down the street saying, what is going on here? You know, you see private stalls popping up on streets. You saw advertisements. I remember once getting in those days it was Minhang, what is it, China, I don't know, whatever the word is in English for China Airlines then. And they had started a glossy magazine, just like every other airline in the world. And I opened it up and there was an advertisement for opium perfume. Practically knocked me out of my seat. I thought, what is happening here? And then it was just a procession throughout the 80s, one thing after another would pop up. Fashion, advertisements, cars, you know, discos, you name it. There were all kinds of incredible things, hookers in the street. And each of those things was not proclaimed. It just was the result of concrete reforms that somehow Deng Xiaoping managed to push through. Can Xi Jinping do that? I don't know. But I think he'd like to. Oh, yeah, okay. How about right here then? I'll do him and then I'll do you. Okay. Here.
Thank you for giving this talk and really appreciate it. I'm a second year undergraduate here in the college and want to have a comment on your previous comment and also have a question. So my comment is addressing the question you raised about, you know, I'm born and raised in China. I've been
Whereabouts?
Here. What?
Whereabouts?
Where? 1 hour south of Shanghai. So I came here. So you talked about the problem of these Chinese students come here into U.S. You know, are they more nationalistic or not? So I want to express my view from my standpoint. So I think I came here for the only reason I came here is that I think the undergraduate education here, the quality of education is better than China, and being here, I only see my passion, my love for my country growing. Instead of, I don't see any way in which the American ideology has been superior to the Chinese ones. I don't see any way. You know, I just feel even more patriotic.
You do. That
Yes,
sounds
I
very
do.
interesting.
I do.
Yeah.
So.
And are you proud that China has managed to develop as rapidly and as it has?
I mean, it's a double plate thing. You know, there are different aspects.
Mm-hmm.
It's growing, but its social problems are growing as well as the economy goes. It's just, yeah. So, just want to address this question to you. Have another question. Like my question is, going forward, as China grows in its power, and you know, international level, how would you think? You know, in what aspects and to what extent do you think it poses threat? And from a U.S. standpoint, to what extent and in what aspect do you think it poses threat to the U.S.? And also, what are some of the prospects there are, you know, for U.S. and China to grow in a way that one doesn't have to necessarily harm the other to grow for itself? For example, we see every Apple products are made in China, so this could be a good example for, you know, this kind of collaboration. So what's your thought on that? Thank you.
You know, I think that creative minds could very quickly make a list of things that the U.S. and China could do together, which would be very symbolic, very meaningful, and sort of begin to express a different set of intentions on both sides. Let me give you one example. Typhoon in the Philippines. The typhoon in the Philippines hit. China said it would give $100,000, what was it? $100 million, excuse me.
No,
$100,000. $100,000, okay. Whatever it was, I understand that. But, so the first announcement was a paltry small sum. Now the U.S. is sending, I don't know how many ships, 1,000 Marines, helicopters and things, and then China raised the level of its support. I think what should have happened is Xi Jinping should have called up Barack Obama, or Barack Obama should have called up Xi Jinping and said, let's help the Philippines together. What's wrong with that? That is like Deng Xiaoping putting the cowboy hat on his head. But to do that, you have to, China now is obsessively talking about innovation. Every other sentence is on innovation. But it's not that innovative. This would be innovation. So I think it's this kind of thinking where the US and China could do some things together which would sort of bespeak of a different kind of intention, which would be really important. Now, you asked one other thing quickly. Do you remember?
Ask you what are the threats and what are the prospects?
Yeah. I don't know. I think the United States is willing. My critique of the United States now is there's nobody in the US government really minding the Chinese store. No one's paying a lot of attention to it. Kerry's off in the Middle East. The National Security Council is no really bold leadership there. Obama is not quite on the front burner with him. He's got other things happening, and I think that's a problem. And we're here because of the Paulson Institute. When Hank Paulson was Secretary of the Treasury, he and Wang Qishan were like two, local lords who they were the two go-to guys on China. They had a very rich, ongoing, friendly dialogue. There was a way to exchange ideas. There was trust. We don't have anything like that now, and I think we miss it.
Thank you, Orville. I want to get back to the issue of the narrative. I find it striking. The narrative you presented is very much the dominant interpretation of the Chinese national narrative. But of course, when we think back, first of all, the Communist Party itself actually came to power, so sort of partly by latching onto the ideas of liberty, liberal democracy, and especially in fighting against authoritarian rule. It's a narrative that is no longer allowed in China to some extent. But nonetheless, what's interesting today in China is, on the one hand, we have this dominant national narrative, but at the same time, there are a lot of people on the Weibo and so on who keep on reminding people that there is alternative. Yeah. In fact, let me emphasize that on the one hand, President Xi has emphasized confidence in the future in China's road and all that. But a lot of the action speaks of a lack of confidence. Yeah. And in that, I think part of the issue, it goes back to the media. I mean, one of the things I've been watching is how there is, in some way, the national panic. At the highest level, in the sense that increasingly people are deserting the official media. The younger people are simply not watching TV anymore. In other words, however much the Communist Party has its traditional channels in disseminating information and all that, is no longer reaching a great proportion of the population. So in that sense, actually, there is this counter-narrative that's very significant. So in many ways, I would appreciate your thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. There is this sort of pot boiling underneath the official media on Weibo and Weixin, things like that. However, I think that it's in a country like China where not only since 1949, but previously, it's always very important to have the official imprimatur put on, whether it's a dynastic history or a sort of historical interpretation or a narrative. I think that that's what really is needed because it gets into the schools, it gets into the textbooks, it gets into all sorts of the media, and then it slowly gets into national consciousness. So I think you're right, there's an incredible sort of laboratory of new ideas boiling up on the internet, but it's disaggregated. And it doesn't have any kind of unity. It isn't even unified to the degree that, let's say, during the May 4th movement, something like the ideas that came out of that, out of, youth, Xinjiang, those publications, had a kind of a unity to it, voices that people could get used to, and it formed a kind of a coherent corpus of ideas and thinking. And that's what the government or the party could do if it chose to. But I think it probably isn't about to do that. And I'm not quite sure why it clings to the old narrative. So maybe it just doesn't like foreigners like me saying it's time to write another chapter. Often, I can understand that.
Could I add to this
Yeah.
in some ways? Because one of the most interesting issues in recent months has been this attack in some newspapers, for example, in China, against constitutionalism.
Yeah.
Right? It's even got into a allegedly secret document that's translated onto your website, China File, and I strongly urge everyone.
Document 9.
That's right. But what's interesting is how striking is the internet and people who are pro-constitution actually essentially beat back that document. I mean, I just saw the decision of the third plenum. In fact, there is right there, writing in the document is respect for the authority of the Constitution. Nobody, whatever attacks on the constitutionalism and all that is not really winning the discourse.
Yeah.
It's the people who are emphasizing respect for the Constitution that's winning the discourse in China. And that speaks something in the sense that despite what the party is trying to do, in fact, already within China, there is actually, in some ways, those people who are attacking constitutionalism taught by negative example that the Chinese society today, there is a wellspring of respect for the Constitution that actually eventually dominated the discourse.
Yeah, and of course China also has become a nation that has more than just one voice now. And so we're often not sure what voice is speaking. Is it a faction? Is it, there was this film, what was it called? By the Guofang Daxue.
This silent contest.
Silent Contest. An incredible film. It was attacking the Ford Foundation, the Carter Center, and the International Republican Research Institute as, sort of spy agencies out to undermine China and promote peaceful evolution and the overthrow of the party. Well, so I asked a friend, a scholar about this, Chinese friend, he said, don't pay any attention to the film. What's important is it's been taken off the internet. So whose voice was that? Well, we don't know. But we have to kind of get used to the fact that China now speaks in many voices. And even though the Communist Party has one voice, it's still powerful. But there's a lot of other things going on. I don't know, Evan, how...
Why don't you
one more?
Take two or three.
Take more. Okay, how about right here?
Thank you very much for coming today. My name is Colleen, a second-year MPP student, and I actually internship in the National Committee on U.S China Relations this summer. Mm-hmm. And my question would be, do you think that more corporations in the non-government level of U.S. and China would actually improve the U.S. China relation in the government level?
More corporations?
Yeah, like in the business or industrial size?
Well, there are already a lot of business going on with China. There's a lot of corporations doing business in China. Some are doing well, some pretty happy, some are not doing well and they're not happy. I think it's probably in balance a good thing, the more business we have. I don't think it's the answer alone. All kinds of sort of musculature between the two countries is important. I think almost more important is sort of civil society. But the party is still quite ambivalent about civil society organizations in China because they're independent. And it doesn't really want a lot of independent voices mouthing off and, you know, in their view, creating kind of disunity and trouble. So I think all of these things help. But I think finally, what we really do need is something to happen at the center, some bold leadership, not just statement, but, and I know it's not easy to do, but I think it's necessary. Okay, let's see. I was going to point to you, so why don't I do you? Yeah.
So back to climate change, given the need to sort of very quickly reduce our carbon emissions, do you think that the world is going to see or should see more soft authoritarian China-style governments that can kind of push these changes through?
You know, when Obama first came to office and my Berkeley colleague Steve Chu was appointed energy secretary, I thought, here's a real opportunity. And we worked with him and wrote a whole roadmap for the US and China to collaborate. And I thought this is exactly the kind of place where the US and China could cooperate because we have exactly the same interest. And then what happened? The US Congress killed off the climate bill, and the lights went out in Washington on anything constructive to do with climate except a few little minor programs, and nothing happened. And I think actually on this front, you know, China's run by engineers and technocrats largely. There are a few others. And I think actually they don't have a lot of voodoo kind of religious climate deniers. They're pretty scientifically minded, and they're pretty serious about doing something about this in their own way, through energy efficiency, things like that. But what's missing is US leadership. And I think we'd get a lot more mileage out of the Chinese, and the Europeans would jump on in a minute if the US could find some way to play the role that when it plays it well, it plays it very well. And when it doesn't play it or plays it badly, it's very bad or it's zero. And we're pretty much zero. And, you know, it's not like something that doesn't matter. So I don't know what the answer is. I think Obama would like to do something, but the Congress won't have it. And so China's left alone to do what it does. And I think, I was just talking to Evan about this, I think the way forward is at the subnational level. And I'm working with Governor Jerry Brown of California to do a plan to work with China, states, regions. I think that's the way we're going to have to go. Businesses, NGOs, because Washington's frozen. All right, on that incredibly elevating final thought, let me bid you all adieu, and thank you so much for coming.